My name is John Smith, I'm 82 years old, and I'm about to tell the most shocking story you've ever heard about greed, family betrayal, and an inheritance that changed everything. If you think you know your own family, if you believe that blood is thicker than water, prepare to have your certainties shattered, because what I discovered about my own children made me question everything I believed about unconditional love. Imagine discovering that your children see you more as a bank account than as a father. Imagine realizing that the only people who truly care about you don't share your blood. Imagine having to choose between the family you created and the family that chose you. For 40 years, I kept a secret that could change anyone's life, a fortune in gold hidden on my property. Enough gold to buy entire ranches, to turn beggars into millionaires, to make anyone forget their moral principles. But this gold was more than wealth. It was a trap, a test created by my grandfather, passed down to my father, and which I applied to my own children. A test that revealed the true nature of the people I loved most. I had 18 children, 18, and when I told each of them about the gold buried in the yard, do you know how many resisted the temptation? How many chose to trust me instead of digging like madmen in the middle of the night? Only one. One son out of 18 passed the test of loyalty. The other 17 showed me that when it comes to gold, even the bonds of blood can break. But the story doesn't end there, because at 77, when I thought my life was over, fate introduced me to people who would teach me the true meaning of the word family. People who passed my tests without even knowing they were being tested. You will discover how a simple widowed cook and her 3 children achieved what 17 of my own children failed to do. You will understand why sometimes we need to lose one family to find another, and you will see how a fortune hidden for 3 generations finally found its true purpose. This is a story about choices, about the moment when each person reveals who they truly are when gold is at stake, about discovering that the greatest wealth isn't buried in the yard, but planted in the hearts of the right people. Prepare to learn family secrets that have been kept for almost a century, to understand how greed can blind even those we love most, and to discover that sometimes the family we choose is worth more than the family we were born into. Because at the end of this story, you will understand that not all that glitters is gold, and not all that matters glitters like gold. So sit comfortably and prepare for a journey that will change your perspective on family, loyalty, and what truly matters in life. This is my story, and it begins long before I was born. It was a June morning when I decided to tell this story. The sky was grey, just like my hair that has seen over 80 winters, and the wind rustled the leaves of the old oak tree I planted more than 40 years ago. It was under this tree that I buried all my gold, an inheritance I received from my grandfather William when I turned 15. But this story doesn't start with me. It starts much earlier, in the golden hills of California, where my grandfather made his fortune digging for precious stones and golden nuggets. My name is John Smith. I am 82 years old, and this is the story of how 3 generations of men in my family used gold to discover the true value of the people around us. William Smith, my grandfather, arrived in California in 1849 when he was only 16. He came from the East Coast with a bundle on his back and a dream in his head, to find enough gold to change his life. In those days, the area was buzzing with prospectors from all over the world. They were tough men, accustomed to hard work and the uncertainty of finding the precious metal. My grandfather was different from the other prospectors. While many spent the gold they found on liquor and gambling, he saved every nugget, every coin, every golden fragment he could extract from the earth. For 30 years, he worked from sunup to sundown, always alone, always suspicious. He said that gold brings out the worst in people, and so he preferred to work without partners. In 1880, when he was 47 and had a considerable fortune hidden in various spots on his property, my grandfather decided to get married. He chose Sarah, a simple woman, the a daughter of a local merchant. She was 22 and accepted the marriage arranged by her parents, unaware of the wealth William possessed. It was a prosperous marriage. In 25 years, Sarah gave birth to 28 children. Yes, 28. Back then, families were large, and my grandfather wanted many descendants. Some say he wanted to test his theory about human nature with a significant sample size. Others believe he simply loved children. The truth, I discovered years later, was a bit of both. My grandfather developed a peculiar method for testing the character of his children. Each one who turned 15 received a special talk. William would say he had hidden a small fortune in a specific place on the property, always changing the story, always inventing a different location. Then he would watch. If the next day the place was torn up, full of holes, he knew that child had failed the test of patience and trust. On the back fence of the property, there was a wooden plank where my grandfather marked the names. With an old pocket knife, he carved the name of each child who had dug for the gold before the right time. That plank became a silent record of human greed. Of the 28 children, only one passed the test, my father, Anthony Smith. When he turned 15 in 1943, my grandfather told him he had buried gold under the peach tree in the yard. Dad listened to the story, thanked him for the trust, and never brought it up again. Days passed, weeks passed, and the peach tree remained untouched. Intrigued, my grandfather decided to wait longer. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Nothing. My father continued his normal routine. He woke up early, helped with the chores on the property, studied when he could, and treated his father with the same respect as always. It was then that William understood he had found a son he could completely trust. When my grandfather was on his deathbed in 1945, he called my father for a final talk. He was weak, but his mind remained sharp. For 10 consecutive days, he told stories of the family, of the gold rush days, of the dreams he had and the disappointments he faced. He spoke about each of his children, about the disappointments he experienced, seeing greed in the eyes of his own descendants. On the 10th day, feeling the end was near, my grandfather revealed the whole truth. There were 3 small stashes scattered across the property, one under the peach tree, the same one he had mentioned to my father, another behind the old house, and a third near the pond. Each contained a modest amount of gold and old coins. But the main treasure was elsewhere, in a secret cave behind the waterfall at Gold Creek, about 2 miles from the house. There, my grandfather had accumulated most of his fortune, nuggets, gold coins, and even some precious stones he had found over the years. "Anthony, my son," said my grandfather with a weak voice, "you passed the greatest test. You loved your father more than his gold. Therefore, all of this is yours. But I want you to make a promise. Use this wealth wisely, and if you ever have children, test them as I tested mine. Gold reveals the true character of people." My father made the promise, and when I was born in 1942, 3 years before my grandfather's death, he already knew that one day he would have to make a difficult decision about my inheritance. I grew up hearing stories about my grandfather William, but I never knew the real extent of his wealth. My father was a discreet, hard-working man who managed our small coastal farm with dedication. We had a simple but comfortable life. We raised cattle, planted corn and beans, and sold part of the produce in the nearest town. When I turned 15 in 1957, my father called me for a serious talk. It was a Sunday morning, and we were sitting on the porch of the house, watching the chickens in the yard. "John," he said, "it's time for you to know some things about our family." And then he told me everything. The story of the prospector grandfather, the 28 children, the gold test, the plank with the carved names, and the hidden inheritance. He showed me the 3 smaller stashes and took me to the waterfall cave where the main treasure was kept. "Now you have to make a choice," my father said. "You can take this gold and do whatever you want with it, or you can wait, learn about life, and one day maybe understand why your grandfather created this test. I looked at that. Wealth glittering in the dim light of the cave. There was enough gold to buy several ranches, to live a life of luxury, to never have to work the land again. But something in my father's voice, something in the story he had told, made me hesitate. "Dad," I replied, "if you think it's not time yet, I trust your judgment." He smiled and hugged me. "You're just like me, boy, and just like your grandfather. This wealth will stay here waiting for the right moment." We left the cave, and my father sealed the entrance again with rocks and vegetation. For years, I passed by that spot knowing a fortune was hidden there, but I never felt the urge to take it before its time. When I married Mary in 1965, I was 23 and had already decided to follow my father's example. We built our life on honest work, dedication to family, and the values we had inherited from our ancestors. Mary was a wonderful woman, the daughter of a small merchant in town. She had brown hair always tied in a bun, eyes that smiled even before her mouth did, and infinite patience with the peculiarities of the Smith family. When I told her about the hidden inheritance, she just nodded and said, "John, if your ancestors kept this gold for so many years, there must be a reason. When the time is right, we'll know." Our house was simple but welcoming. 3 bedrooms, a large living room, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, and a porch where we spent our afternoons talking about plans for the future. In the yard, I planted the oak tree that would become central to my own version of the gold test. The first years of marriage were filled with hard work and much happiness. We expanded the cattle herd, improved the crops, and gradually our property became one of the most productive in the region. No one suspected we possessed a hidden fortune. For all intents and purposes, we were just another hard-working farming family. In 1967, our first son was born, Charles. Maria followed in 1969, Joseph in 1971, Anne in 1973, and so on. Over 20 years, Mary gave me 18 children. It was a large, noisy family, full of life and joy. Each child born brought new responsibilities and new joys. The house was always full of laughter, crying, games, and small squabbles between siblings. Mary managed that chaos with impressive skill, always knowing where each child was, what each one needed, and how to resolve the conflicts that arose. I worked from sunup to sundown to support the family. I woke up before dawn, tended to the cattle, checked the crops, mended fences, and only stopped when it got dark. It was hard, but rewarding work. I knew I was building something solid for my children, even if they didn't know about the wealth that awaited them. During all these years, the secret of the gold remained kept. Sometimes, when I was alone in the waterfall cave, I would look at that fortune and wonder if I was doing the right thing. My children could have a better education, nicer clothes, more expensive toys. But I remembered the words of my grandfather and my father. Gold reveals the true character of people. When Charles, my firstborn, approached 15, I began to prepare myself psychologically to repeat the test my grandfather had created. I watched my son, trying to understand his personality, his values, his way of seeing the world. He was an intelligent boy, but sometimes he showed a worrying impatience for things that didn't come quickly. One night in 1982, when Charles had just turned 15, I called him for a talk on the porch. The moon was full, illuminating the yard, where the oak tree was already well developed. "Charles," I began, "I want to tell you something important about our family." And then I told a partial version of the story. I said that when I was young, I had found gold on the property and decided to bury it for the future. I told him I had hidden a good amount under the peach tree, near the chicken coop. "But this gold is not for now," I explained. "It's for when you really need it, when you're more mature to handle this responsibility." Charles listened attentively, asked a few questions about the quantity and value, and went to bed. I stayed on the porch for a few more hours, watching the stars and wondering if my son would pass the test. The next morning I woke up before dawn to check the cattle. When I passed the chicken coop, my heart sank. The place was completely torn up, holes everywhere, dirt scattered. The chickens, agitated by the disturbance. Charles had been digging all night for the gold I had mentioned. With a heavy heart, I went to the back fence and carved the first name on the wooden plank, Charles Smith. It was the beginning of a long list that would grow over the next few years. From that day on, I began to see Charles with different eyes. He tried to hide it, but I could tell he was frustrated at not having found the gold. Sometimes I would catch him looking at other corners of the property, as if planning where else he could dig. Greed had awakened in him, and it saddened me deeply. Have you ever been tested by someone you loved? Have you ever been in the position of choosing between immediate gain and long-term trust? In the next chapter, you will discover how each of my 18 children reacted to the gold test, and a revelation that will completely change your perspective on what really matters in life. The tests continued for years, and the result was more surprising than you can imagine. The years that followed Charles's test were filled with painful discoveries about human nature. With each child who turned 15, I repeated the ritual created by my grandfather, always changing the location of the supposed hidden treasure. And with each test, the plank on the back fence gained a new carved name. Maria was the second to be tested. When she turned 15 in 1984, I invented a story about gold buried near the pond where we used to fish on Sundays. She listened with eyes shining with interest, asking detailed questions about how I had found the gold and why I had decided to hide it there. "Dad," she said with that sweet smile that always won me over, "thank you for trusting me. I'll keep this secret." The next morning, the area around the pond was riddled with holes. Maria had taken Joseph and Anne, her younger siblings, to help her dig. When I confronted them, she lowered her head and mumbled, "Sorry, Dad. I thought you wouldn't mind if I just took a little." Look, I carved the second name on the plank, Maria Smith. Joseph was tested in 1986. This time, I said the gold was buried under the century-old pine tree in the middle of the yard. He was a quieter boy than his siblings, and for a moment, I thought he might be different. But the next morning, I found the roots of the pine tree exposed and damaged by the holes he had dug during the night. The third name joined the others, Joseph Smith. Anne was tested in 1988. I created a story about gold hidden in the old caretaker's cottage, which was abandoned at the back of the property. She hugged me and said she felt honored by the trust. The next day, the abandoned cottage looked like it had been hit by an earthquake. Anne had broken several floorboards in her desperate search for the treasure. Fourth name, Anne Smith. Peter in 1989. Lucy in 1991. Anthony Jr. in 1993. Rose in 1995. Frank in 1997. Helen in 1999. Michael in 2001. Teresa in 2003. John Jr. in 2005. Barbara in 2007. Thomas in 2009, Elizabeth in 2011, Matthew in 2013. 16 children tested, 16 names carved on the plank, 16 disappointments that hardened my heart with each passing year. Each test followed the same pattern. I invented a new location for the gold, always creating a convincing story about how I had found or hidden the treasure in that specific place. The children would listen attentively, sometimes asking questions, always promising to keep it a secret. And the next morning, the place would be completely destroyed by the nocturnal excavation. Some were more discreet, digging small strategic holes. Others, like Frank and Michael, looked like they had used dynamite. Such was the destruction they caused. Helen even recruited some cousins to help her, promising to share the treasure with them. Thomas tried a different strategy. Instead of digging immediately, he waited a week, thinking I wouldn't suspect, but the result was the same. What hurt me most was not their greed itself, but the breach of trust. Each one had promised to keep the secret, had looked me in the eye, and sworn they would guard the information responsibly. And they all broke that promise at the first opportunity. Mary watched my growing sadness with concern. One night in 2013, after I discovered the holes Matthew had made behind the new barn, she sat with me on the porch and said, "John, you're torturing yourself with these tests. Maybe it's time to stop." "Just one more left," I replied, looking at Ben, our youngest, who was playing in the yard with a wooden car I had made for him. "If he fails too, at least I'll know I tried. And if he fails too, what will you do?" It was a question that had haunted me for years. If Ben also failed the test, it would mean that all my children were driven by greed. It would mean that as a father, I might have failed to pass on the right values. It would mean that the family tradition would end with me. I don't know, Mary. Honestly, I don't know. During the months leading up to Ben's 15th birthday, I watched him with special attention. He was different from his older siblings in many ways. While the others always showed a certain hurry to grow up, to have new things, to get more than they had, Ben seemed content with the simple life we led. He was a contemplative boy who liked to sit with me on the porch at the end of the day to hear family stories. He had a special affection for the animals on the property and always worried when one of them was sick. On Sundays, when we went to town for church, he never asked to buy anything in the stores, unlike his siblings who always wanted candy, toys, or new clothes. There was something in the way Ben related to people that gave me hope. He showed an unusual patience for his age and an ability to listen that most adults did not possess. When his older siblings came to visit with their own children, Ben always volunteered to look after the little ones, inventing games and telling stories. In March 2015, when Ben turned 15, I decided to do the final test. But this time, I chose a location that had a special meaning. The oak tree I had planted when I married Mary, 50 years earlier. That tree held my best memories. It was under it that I proposed to Mary. It was there that we played with our first children. It was in its shade that we spent countless afternoons talking about our dreams and plans. If Ben were to dig there, it would be like desecrating a sacred place for our family. On the night of his birthday, after the small party we had with homemade cake and soda, I called Ben for a private talk. We sat on the porch, in the same spot where I had tested all his siblings. "Ben," I began, choosing my words carefully, "you're a man now. It's time for you to know some things about our family that only the adults know." He looked at me with those serious, attentive eyes that always reminded me of myself at his age. "When I was young," I continued, "I found a considerable amount of gold here on the property. I decided to bury it for the future, for times of need, or to leave as an inheritance for my children." Ben listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally. "This gold is buried under the oak tree, the one I planted when I married your mother. It's a good amount, enough to change your life, to buy more land, to have a more comfortable life." I paused, observing his reaction. There was no greed in his eyes, only respectful attention. "But this gold is not for now," I concluded. "It's for when you're really ready for the responsibility that comes with it, when you're mature enough to use it wisely. For now, it's our secret. Can you promise me that?" Ben was silent for a few moments, looking at the oak tree that was visible from the porch, illuminated by the moonlight. "Dad," he said finally, "if you buried that gold, you have your reasons. If you think it's not time for me to have access to it, I trust your judgment. And thank you for trusting me with this secret." He stood up, hugged me, and went to sleep. I spent the whole night awake on the porch, watching the oak tree. With each passing hour, my anxiety grew. At 3 a.m, I lit a cigarette, a habit I had picked up in recent years, and smoked while watching for any suspicious movement in the yard. At 5 a.m, when the first rooster crowed, I got up to check the cattle as I did every morning. My heart was pounding as I approached the oak tree. The tree was exactly as it had been the night before. No holes, no turned-over soil, no sign that anyone had touched it. The acorn still hung from the branches, untouched and glistening with the morning dew. I felt a mix of relief and joy that I hadn't experienced in decades. Finally, one of my children had passed the test. Throughout that week, I discreetly observed Ben's behavior. He maintained his normal routine. He woke up early to help with the farm chores, went to school in town, came back in the late afternoon, and helped with household tasks. He showed no special interest in the oak tree, didn't look at it differently, and didn't make any additional comments or questions about the gold. A month passed. The oak tree remained untouched. 2 months, nothing. 3 months. Ben continued to treat me with the same respect as always, without showing frustration or impatience. At the end of the 3rd month, I decided to talk to him again. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we were mending a fence at the back of the property. "Ben," I said, trying to sound casual, "do you remember that conversation we had about the buried gold?" "Yes, Dad, I remember." "And why did you never go looking for it?" He stopped working and looked me straight in the eye. "Dad, if you buried that gold, you have your reasons. You said it wasn't time for me to have access to it, so it's not time. When you think the right moment has come, you'll let me know. In the meantime, I'd rather help you with whatever you need and learn more about life." At that moment, I knew with certainty that I had found my worthy heir. Have you ever tested the loyalty of someone close to you? Have you ever had to choose between immediate trust and the patience to wait for the right moment? Leave a comment telling us what city you're reading this story from, and share a situation where patience was rewarded in your life. And don't forget to hit like if this story is touching your heart, because what comes next will show how life sometimes tests us in ways we never imagined. In the next chapter, you will discover how life had an unexpected surprise in store for me that would completely change the course of our family. A devastating loss that would make me question everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of wealth. And how, in my old age, I would find people who would teach me that family is not just a matter of blood. The years following Ben's successful test were relatively peaceful on our property. My youngest son continued to live with us even after turning 18, helping with the farm work and demonstrating a maturity that made me deeply proud. The other children had scattered across the country. Some went to big cities seeking opportunities, others married and started their own families in nearby towns. Mary, my dear wife, was then 65 and still the soul of our home. Her hair had turned completely white, but her eyes kept the same sparkle as when she was young. She tended a small garden behind the house, where she grew herbs and vegetables for her cooking. On Sundays, she prepared special lunches for when some of the children came to visit with their own kids. In 2018, when I was 76, our quiet life was interrupted by devastating news. Mary began to experience constant abdominal pain and a fatigue that wouldn't go away, even with rest. Initially, we thought they were just the natural signs of aging, but when the symptoms intensified, we decided to take her to a doctor in town. The diagnosis was a brutal blow: advanced pancreatic cancer. The doctor, a young man with kind eyes but a grave voice, explained that the disease was in a very advanced stage. Treatment was possible to alleviate the symptoms and perhaps extend her life by a few months, but a cure was out of the question. I remember sitting in that cold hospital room, holding Mary's hand, trying to process the doctor's words. 53 years of marriage. 53 years of building a life together, raising 18 children, facing hardships and celebrating joys. And now, suddenly, it was all coming to an end. Mary faced the news with the same serenity she had faced all of life's challenges. On the way home, she looked at me and said, "John, I don't want to die in a hospital. I want to be at home in our room, looking at the oak tree through the window." I respected her wish. We turned our bedroom into a kind of home infirmary, with all the necessary equipment to keep her comfortable. Ben was tireless in his care for his mother, taking turns with me on night vigils and managing her medications at the correct times. During the 4 months that followed, our house became a pilgrimage site for children, grandchildren, and relatives who came to say goodbye to Mary. Some came frequently, others appeared sporadically. I watched with interest the different ways each child dealt with their mother's approaching death. Charles, the firstborn, showed up every week, always bringing expensive gifts he thought might help. Orthopedic mattresses, television sets, imported medicines. It was his way of showing love, but I could tell he was uncomfortable with the reality of imminent death. Maria came with her teenage children, trying to maintain an optimistic atmosphere. She talked about future plans, trips they would take when her mother got better, family parties they would organize. It was hard for her to accept that there would be no "when she gets better." Joseph and Anne took turns visiting, but they always seemed in a hurry to leave. The presence of death made them visibly nervous, and their conversations were always superficial, avoiding talk about Mary's actual condition. Peter, Lucy, and Anthony Jr. came together, usually on Sundays, and spent a few hours reminiscing about their childhood. They were pleasant visits, but I could see they also struggled to find the right words in the situation. Rose and Frank, who lived farther away, made a point of spending a few weeks with us during the most critical period. Helen and Michael came when they could, always burdened with guilt for not being able to be present more often due to work commitments. Teresa, John Jr., and Barbara organized a rotation system, ensuring there was always someone from the family present. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Matthew, being the youngest after Ben, showed a mix of sadness and confusion at the first major loss they would face in the family. But it was Ben who truly stood out. He not only took care of Mary's physical needs, but also seemed to intuitively understand her emotional needs. He would spend hours sitting by her bed, holding her hand, talking about happy memories, or simply remaining in companionable silence when she didn't have the strength to speak. During one of these night vigils, Mary called me for a private talk. Ben had gone to town to pick up medicine, and we were alone in the room. "John," she said with a weak but determined voice, "I want to talk about Ben." "What about him?" "You were right to trust him. He's different from the others, you know that. But I want you to promise me something. Anything, my love. When I'm gone, don't let bitterness take over your heart. The other children, they aren't bad, they're just human, and you're going to need company. Don't close yourself off from the world." I promised, not imagining how prophetic her words would be. Mary passed away one morning in September 2018, sleeping peacefully as I held her hand. Ben was on the other side of the bed, and together we watched her final moments. There was no drama, no grand final words, just a smooth transition for someone who had lived a full life and was ready to rest. The funeral was a reunion of the entire Smith family. Children, grandchildren, sons-in-law, daughters-in-law, all came to pay their last respects to the family matriarch. It was a moment of temporary unity, where differences were set aside in a favor of the shared memory of an extraordinary woman. But after everyone left, after the house became empty again, the reality of the loss set in with full force. The following months were the hardest of my life. The house, which for decades had been full of life and movement, became an empty echo of memories. Every corner held a memory of Mary, the chair where she used to sit and sew, the kitchen where she prepared her special recipes, the porch where we spent afternoons talking about the children. Ben stayed with me during this period, being my emotional and practical support. He took care of the meals, the cleaning, and the animals, but I realized his constant presence was also a sacrifice. At 23, he should have been exploring the world, meeting people his age, perhaps finding a partner. Instead, he was taking care of a melancholy widower. The visits from the other children became increasingly sparse. Initially, in the first few months after Mary's death, they still came with some regularity, bringing homemade food and trying to liven up the atmosphere. But as time went on, the visits dwindled. I began to notice a pattern in the few visits I did receive. Invariably, the conversation would turn to me selling the property and moving to the city. The arguments were always the same. I was getting old, the house was too big for one person, it would be safer to live near medical resources and some of the children. "Dad," Charles would say during one of these visits, "you're being stubborn. You could sell this land for a good price and buy a comfortable house in the city. We'd help you get settled." "It's true, Dad," Maria would add. "You're isolated out here. What if you get sick? What if you need help? Ben can't take care of you forever." These conversations bothered me deeply. It wasn't just that they wanted me to sell the property where I had built my life. It was the feeling that they saw my staying here as a burden, a problem to be solved. None of them offered to come live with me or to spend more time with me. The solution they proposed was always to remove me from the environment where I felt at home. One day, Maria was more direct. "Dad, you're wasting this land staying here alone. You could sell it for a fortune and still leave a good inheritance for all of us." It was at that moment that I understood that, for most of my children, I had become more valuable dead than alive. They weren't concerned with my well-being, but with the inheritance they could receive. Ironically, they had no idea of the true extent of the wealth I possessed. The property they wanted me to sell was worth a considerable amount, but the gold hidden in the waterfall cave was worth many times more. If they knew that, the pressure for me to sell everything would probably be even greater. During this period of growing isolation, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the lessons my grandfather had tried to teach me. The gold test wasn't just about immediate greed. It was about the ability to put relationships above material possessions, to value trust over instant wealth. My children had failed this test when they were teenagers, and now, as adults, they seemed to be failing again. The difference was that now it wasn't about gold buried in the yard, but about the pressure for me to sell my home and land to make their lives easier. Only Ben continued to show that he understood the true value of things. He never mentioned selling the property, never pressured me to make decisions that would make his life easier. On the contrary, he seemed genuinely interested in preserving our simple life on the farm. It was during one of these lonely reflections that I made a decision that would completely change the course of my final years. In January 2019, a few months after Mary's death, I placed an ad in the local newspaper looking for a cook and housekeeper to help with the house. It wasn't that Ben couldn't handle the chores. He was extremely dedicated, but I realized he needed more freedom to live his own life, and I needed female companionship to fill the void left by Mary. Several candidates showed up for the interview. Some were too young and seemed only interested in the salary. Others were qualified, but showed a professional coldness that wasn't what I was looking for. I wanted someone who could bring some human warmth back into our home. That's when I met Susan Miller. Susan was 60, a widow for 5 years, and had a serene presence that immediately caught my attention. Her grey hair was always neatly styled, her brown eyes conveyed a genuine kindness, and there was a dignity in her posture that impressed me. During the interview, she told her story simply and directly. She had been married for 30 years to a mechanic in town with whom she had 3 children. When her husband died of a heart attack, she had to work to support herself and ended up specializing in housekeeping and caring for the elderly. "Mr. Smith," she said in a calm voice, "I'm not just a cook. I like to take care of people to make them feel at home. I lost my husband a few years ago, and I understand the loneliness of those left behind." There was something in the way she spoke that immediately put me at ease. It wasn't pity, it wasn't professional condescension. It was genuine empathy from someone who had gone through similar experiences. I hired her that same week. Susan's arrival brought a gradual but significant transformation to our home. She arrived every morning at 7, prepared breakfast, took care of the cleaning and organizing, and made delicious lunches that reminded me of the meals Mary used to make. But more important than her domestic skills was her conversational ability. During meals, she told stories about her children, her previous jobs, the changes she had observed in the town over the years. They were simple, everyday conversations, but they filled the oppressive silence that had settled in the house. Ben also liked Susan immediately. She treated him with the maternal affection he hadn't received since his mother's death, and he reciprocated by helping her with the heavier tasks and talking about his plans for the future. A few weeks after her arrival, Susan asked me a question that took me by surprise. "Mr. Smith, don't you miss having someone special in your life?" We were in the kitchen. She was washing the lunch dishes and I was drying them, a domestic routine that had naturally established itself between us. What do you mean, Susan? A companion, someone to share your thoughts with, to talk about important things. I know you loved your wife very much, but life goes on. The question made me reflect on something I had avoided thinking about. At 77, after more than 50 years of marriage, was there still room for a new romantic relationship? I've never thought about it, I answered honestly. Mary was the only woman in my life, and you were. Lucky to have a love like that, she said with a gentle smile. But that doesn't mean the heart can't open again to another form of affection. That conversation planted a seed in my mind that would grow slowly over the following months. As time went on, I realized that my relationship with Susan was evolving from a simple professional one to something closer to a genuine friendship. She knew my habits, knew when I was melancholy, noticed when I needed company or silence, and I, in turn, began to take a genuine interest in her life, her children, her concerns. It was then that I decided to test her in the same way I had tested my children. The next chapter will reveal how fate sometimes presents us with people who completely change our perspective on loyalty and true love. You will discover how one last test would reveal something about human nature that would completely surprise me, and how at 80 I would learn that family is not just a matter of blood, but of choice and mutual dedication. Get ready for a discovery that will change everything you thought you knew about this story. In June 2019, after 5 months of harmonious coexistence with Susan, I decided to give her the same test I had used on my children. It wasn't out of distrust. On the contrary, she had proven to be an upright and dedicated person. But my grandfather's lesson had become so deeply ingrained in me that I felt the need to be absolutely sure about the character of the people I allowed into my life. The opportunity arose on a Monday morning, when she arrived for work as usual. I had rehearsed what I would say, creating a convincing story about financial difficulties. "Susan," I began as she was preparing breakfast, "I need to talk to you about a delicate situation." She stopped what she was doing and looked at me attentively. I could tell she had noticed the seriousness in my voice. "I'm going through some financial difficulties," I continued, feeling terrible for lying to someone who had become so important in my life. The expenses with Mary's medication before she passed, the funeral costs, some investments that went wrong. In short, I'm in a tight spot. She listened in silence, with a genuinely concerned expression on her face. "What I mean is, I won't be able to pay your salary for the next 3 months. I know it's a terrible situation, and I would completely understand if you need to look for another job. But if you could continue to help me during this period, I would guarantee that I would pay everything back later with interest." Susan was silent for a few moments, fiddling with the spoon she was holding. I thought she was calculating whether she could afford to work without pay for 3 months. Finally, she looked me in the eye and said, "Mr. Smith, you have always treated me with respect and dignity. When my son Paul was unemployed, you advanced me 2 months' salary without me even asking. When my daughter Sandra got sick, you let me take time off to care for her and still paid me for my days. Now it's my turn to repay you." She paused and continued, "I will continue to come every day, taking care of the house and you. Don't worry about money right now. When things get better, we'll sort it out. The important thing is that you are not left helpless." I felt a lump in my throat. Her response wasn't just about professional loyalty, it was about genuine gratitude and affection. But I went ahead with the test. "Susan, are you sure? 3 months is a long time to go without a salary. I'm sure my children help me when I need it, and I have some savings. You don't need to worry about me." And so began the 3 most revealing months of my relationship with Susan. During this period, she not only maintained her normal work routine, but intensified her care for me. I noticed she was paying extra attention to my diet, preparing dishes she knew I particularly liked. When I coughed at night, she would show up the next day with a homemade tea that was good for the chest. When I seemed melancholy, she always found a funny story to tell me or suggested an activity that might distract me. Even more surprising was discovering that she was cutting back on her own expenses to get by during the period without a salary. On a trip to town, I ran into the owner of the grocery store who told me that Susan had cancelled some regular items from her monthly shopping to reduce costs. She said she's saving to help a boss who is going through hard times, the store owner commented. She's a good-hearted woman. That made me feel even worse about the lie I was maintaining, but it also confirmed that I was in the presence of a truly special person. During these 3 months, I also observed how Ben and Susan interacted. They had developed a very close mother-son relationship. She worried about his studies. He had decided to take a technical course in agriculture, gave him advice on his relationships, and he treated her with the affection and respect he had shown Mary when she was alive. One night, Ben approached me for a private conversation. "Dad," he said, "I'm worried about the financial situation you mentioned. Is there any way I can help? I can look for a job in town to contribute to the household expenses." "No need, son. It's a temporary situation." "But Susan is working without pay. That's not right. She has a family to support." Ben's genuine concern for Susan's well-being touched me deeply. He wasn't just thinking about the financial issue, but the human impact of the situation. At the end of the 3 months, I gathered the whole family, Ben, Susan, and her 3 children, whom I had gotten to know during this period, and who had also offered to help in various ways. "I need to make a confession," I began, feeling like a defendant before a court. "I lied to you about the financial difficulties." Everyone looked at me with expressions of confusion. The truth is, I'm not having financial problems. I made up that story to test your loyalty. The silence that followed was awkward. Susan was the first to react. "Mr. Smith," she said in a calm but clearly hurt voice, "why would you do that?" I explained the family tradition of the test, my grandfather's lessons, the need to know who I could trust. But as I spoke, I realized how cruel and unnecessary it sounded. "I understand you have your reasons," said Paul, Susan's eldest son, "but hurting my mother this way was not right." "He's right," I agreed. "It was wrong of me. I sincerely apologize to all of you. I paid all of Susan's back wages with interest and gave her a substantial bonus as compensation. But the emotional damage was done. For a few days, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Susan continued to perform her professional duties, but there was a coolness in her behavior that hadn't been there before. Ben also showed his disapproval of how I had treated someone he considered part of the family. It was then that I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. One Sunday afternoon, I asked to speak with Susan on the porch. It was the same place where I had tested my children years before, but this time my intention was completely different. "Susan," I began, "I know I hurt you with that foolish test. I know I broke your trust and that it might be hard for you to forgive me." She looked at me in silence, waiting for me to continue. "But I want you to know that these months have taught me something very important. You passed the test, yes, but I failed as a human being. You showed me what true loyalty is, what genuine affection is, what selfless dedication is." I paused, gathering the courage for what I was about to say next. "Susan, I know we're 2 old folks. I know our best years may be behind us, but I've discovered that I feel something for you that I thought I would never feel for anyone again." Her eyes widened in surprise. "I'm asking you to marry me." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Susan looked at me as if she were trying to process what she had just heard. "Mr. Smith," she said finally, "are you sure about what you're saying?" "I am. I've discovered that I don't want to spend the rest of my life without your company, not just as an employee, but as a companion, as a wife, as family." She was silent for a few more moments, and then a small but genuine smile appeared on her face. "You're asking me to marry you after testing me, as if I were just any employee." "I am, and I know I don't deserve a yes after what I did." "You really don't," she said, but the smile was getting bigger. But it turns out I've gotten used to your stubborn company too. And after 5 months of taking care of you without a salary, I think I can handle a lifetime. Have you ever lived a moment when you had to choose between wounded pride and a second chance at love? Have you ever found yourself in the position of forgiving someone who hurt you deeply? Leave a comment from which city you are following this story and tell us about a situation where forgiveness brought something unexpected into your life. And don't forget to like if this narrative is stirring your emotions, because the end of this story holds a surprise that will show how true wealth sometimes appears where we least expect it. In the next chapter, you will discover how my late marriage brought not only a new wife, but a completely new family that would teach me lessons about loyalty I had never imagined. And finally, the moment of full revelation will arrive, when all secrets will be exposed and the true nature of people will be tested for the last time. The wedding to Susan took place 3 months after my proposal in a simple ceremony at the city courthouse. Only Ben, her 3 children, Paul, Sandra and Richard, and 2 old friends who served as witnesses were present. It was a ceremony without pomp, without grand celebrations, but full of meaning and genuine emotion. At 77, I was starting a new life. Susan moved permanently into my house, bringing with her some furniture, many photographs of her children and grandchildren, and a renewing energy that completely transformed the atmosphere. For the first time since Mary's death, the house had life again, lively conversations during meals, and someone who worried if I was taking my medications on time. Susan's children, Paul, Sandra and Richard, were extraordinarily welcoming to me. They were 45, 42 and 39 respectively, all married with their own children. From the beginning they treated me not as their mother's new husband, but as a genuine member of the family. Paul worked as an electrician in town and had 2 teenage sons. Sandra was an elementary school teacher and a mother of 3 young children. Richard managed a small auto repair shop inherited from his father and had a son and a daughter. They were hard-working, honest people who valued the same simple principles I had tried to teach my own children. In the first few months after the wedding, I observed how they interacted with me and Ben. There was no financial interest in their visits. On the contrary, they frequently brought gifts, seasonal fruits, homemade sweets, small repairs they noticed were needed around the house. When they asked about my life, they showed genuine interest in my stories, my childhood memories, the history of the property. Ben, in turn, blossomed with the presence of his new step-siblings. At 25, he finally had a wider social circle, people close to his age with whom he could talk about subjects that I, in my advanced age, couldn't always fully understand. It was by observing these interactions that I began to formulate a plan that would test for the last time the character of the people who had become important in my life. 6 months after the wedding, during a Sunday lunch attended by Ben, Susan and her 3 children, I decided to tell a partial version of the family's gold story, not the complete story. I was still saving that for a more appropriate moment, but a version that would serve my purposes. I want to share something important about our family with you, I began after dessert. Something that only Ben knew until now. Everyone looked at me attentively. When I was young, I discovered gold here on the property, a considerable amount, which I decided to bury in various spots on the land to preserve for the future. Susan looked at me with an expression of surprise. John, why did you never tell me this? Because I wanted to be sure that you were all here for the love of family, not for financial interest, I answered honestly. And where is this gold? Asked Sandra, with natural curiosity. In 3 different places, I partially lied. A little is buried near the pecan tree at the back of the property. Another part is near the artesian well, and a 3rd part is hidden behind the old caretaker's house. Paul leaned forward, interested. And why are you telling us this now? Because you are my family now, and families shouldn't have secrets from each other. In the weeks that followed, I discreetly observed each one's behavior. I made a point of passing by the 3 locations I had mentioned at different times, paying attention to whether they had been disturbed. The pecan tree remained untouched. The artesian well looked the same. The area behind the caretaker's house showed no signs of digging. A week passed. 2 weeks, a month, nothing. Intrigued, I decided to broach the subject directly with Paul one afternoon when he was helping me fix a fence on the property. "Paul," I said casually, "do you remember that conversation about the gold I said I buried here?" "I remember, John. And why did you never go looking for it?" He stopped working and looked at me with an expression that mixed surprise and mild amusement. "John, if you buried something, you have your reasons. Besides, that gold is yours. If one day you want to share it with us, it would be a kindness. If you'd rather keep it for Ben or your other children, that's fine too. We're not here because of gold." "Then why are you here?" "Because of our mother. Because she's happy with you. And because you've become important to us too. You welcomed us, you tell stories to our children, you give us advice when we need it. That's worth more than any gold." I had a similar conversation with Sandra a few days later when she came to visit with her children to play in the yard. "Sandra," I asked as we watched the children run among the trees, "weren't you curious about the gold I mentioned I buried here?" "I was," she admitted. "Who wouldn't be? But curiosity doesn't mean I have a right to anything. That gold is yours, John. If you want to tell us exactly where it is, it would be an honor. If you prefer to keep it a secret, we respect that too. And what if I said a part of it is for you?" She looked at me seriously. "That would be very generous of you, but that's not why we like you. My children already consider you a real grandfather. That's priceless." Richard was even more direct when I had the same conversation with him. "John," he said, "let me tell you something. My father worked his whole life as a mechanic and never got rich. My mother worked for years taking care of other people. We learned that the value of people isn't in what they have, but in who they are. You can have gold buried here, or you could be making it all up. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you make our mother happy and treat us like real children." These conversations touched me deeply. For the first time in decades, I was in the presence of people who truly understood the difference between material value and human value. But there was still one test left: Susan. One evening, when we were alone on the porch after dinner, I decided to bring up the subject with her. "Susan," I said, "weren't you curious about the places where I buried the gold?" She looked at me with that gentle smile I had grown to love. "John, are you testing again?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "That story about financial difficulties. Now this one about buried gold. Can't you just trust people?" I lowered my head, ashamed of being found out. "You're right. It's a hard habit to break. Look here, you stubborn husband of mine," she said, taking my hand. "If you have gold buried somewhere, great. If you don't, that's great too. I didn't marry you for gold. I married you because you make me laugh, because you take care of me when I'm sick, because you know my mother's recipe for apple pie just from hearing me tell it." She smiled and continued, "And another thing, my children don't need tests either. They were raised to work and to value people for who they are, not what they have. If you want to know if you can trust us, the answer is yes. But stop testing everyone as if we were criminals." That night, after Susan fell asleep, I lay awake for hours, reflecting on her words. All my life I had used tests as a way to measure people's character. But perhaps the time had come to simply trust, to accept that some people are genuinely good without needing constant proof. It was then that I made the most important decision of my final years. It was time to reveal the whole truth and trust completely in the people who had become my family. Over the following months, I spent a lot of time observing the dynamics of my new extended family. Susan's children became fully integrated into our routine. Paul came on Saturdays to help with repairs on the property, always accompanied by his teenage sons who loved exploring the farm. Sandra brought her young children to spend afternoons playing in the yard, and often stayed for dinner, helping Susan in the kitchen. Richard showed up when he could, usually bringing some equipment that needed fixing, or some news from his shop. Ben flourished. In this environment, For the first time in his life, he had older siblings who advised him on work, relationships, and future plans. Paul helped him get an internship at a modern farm in the region where he could apply the knowledge from his technical course. Sandra introduced him to some single teachers from her school, and Richard included him in conversations with other young people from town. But what impressed me most was the way they treated our property, not as something they might inherit in the future, but as a family legacy to be preserved and cared for. Paul noticed the roof of the house needed repairs and offered to organize the fix. Sandra suggested we plant a larger vegetable garden to share the produce with our neighbors. Richard brought saplings of fruit trees that he thought would look good in the yard. It was as if they intuitively understood that the property was not just a piece of land, but the heart of a family, a place that needed to be loved and cared for, regardless of who was officially the owner. During this period, my biological children continued their sporadic visits, always with the same conversations about selling the property and moving me to the city. But now, there was a significant difference. They noticed that I was no longer alone and melancholy. The presence of Susan and her family had completely changed the atmosphere of the house. Some of my children took this change well. Charles, for example, seemed genuinely relieved to know I had remarried. "Dad, I'm happy to know you have company," he said during a visit. "Susan seems like a very good person." Others had a more complex reaction. Maria made some subtle comments about people who take advantage of lonely widowers, and Joseph directly questioned whether I had made any kind of prenuptial agreement to protect the family's assets. "Dad," Joseph said in a private conversation, "not that I have anything against Susan, but have you thought about the legal implications of this marriage? What if she wants half of the assets when the time comes?" These reactions clearly showed me the difference between the two families I now had, one that cared about my emotional well-being and another that was concerned with financial matters. It was by observing these contrasts that I began to plan the final moment of revelation. In December 2020, on my 78th birthday, I decided it was time to tell the whole truth about the Smith family inheritance. I organized a special lunch, inviting not only Susan and her children, but also Ben and some of my biological children who lived closer: Charles, Maria, Joseph, Anne, and Peter. It was an interesting gathering. On one side of the table were the members of my biological family, a bit uncomfortable with the presence of the new relatives. On the other side, Susan and her children, who treated everyone with genuine cordiality, including those who had shown some coldness toward them. After lunch, when everyone was gathered in the large living room, I asked for their attention for an important announcement. "I want to take advantage of my birthday to tell a story I've never fully told anyone," I began. "It's the story of the true inheritance of the Smith family." And then, for the first time in my life, I told the complete story. I spoke of my grandfather William, the gold prospector from California, of the 28 children he tested and the 27 who failed, of my father Anthony, the only one who passed the test, of the real inheritance hidden in the waterfall cave, of the tests I applied to my own children, and how only Ben had passed. The silence in the room was palpable. Some faces showed shock, others embarrassment, others intense curiosity. "Those of you who are here and dug for gold when you were teenagers," I continued, looking directly at Charles, Maria, Joseph, Anne, and Peter, "failed the test of patience and trust. Those of you who arrived here today," I looked at Paul, Sandra, and Richard, "passed the test without even knowing you were being tested." Charles was the first to react. "Dad, are you saying there really is gold buried here?" "There is, and much more than you can imagine." Maria leaned forward. "Where exactly?" "That is exactly the kind of reaction that proves the test was necessary," Ben replied, speaking for the first time during the entire conversation. "The first concern wasn't for Dad, but for the location of the gold." Paul shook his head. "John, you didn't need to test us, but I understand why you did it. And whatever your decision is about this inheritance, you'll have our support." The decision has already been made, I announced. I'm going to divide the inheritance among the people who have shown they value relationships over material possessions. Ben, Paul, Sandra, Richard, and Susan. You 5 are my true heirs. What followed was a whirlwind of emotional reactions. Some of my biological children left in anger, promising to legally contest any decision I made. Others were hurt but silent. Charles, surprisingly, approached me and said, "Dad, you're right. I failed the test a long time ago, and I continued to fail as an adult son. I'm sorry." Susan came over and whispered in my ear, "John, are you sure about this? They are your blood children." "Family isn't a matter of blood," I replied loudly so everyone could hear. "It's a matter of love, loyalty, and mutual dedication. You are my true family." In the final chapter of this story, you will discover how these revelations completely changed the family dynamic and what the real fate was for each person involved in this saga. Prepare for a conclusion that will show how sometimes the greatest riches in life come from the most unexpected sources, and how the true inheritance we leave behind are not material goods, but the values we pass on and the love we cultivate. 2 years have passed since that explosive revelation on my 78th birthday. Today, at 80, I sit under the same oak tree where it all began, writing the final pages of this story that forever changed the meaning of the word family in my life. The consequences of that December afternoon in 2020 were profound and lasting. As I had predicted, some of my biological children reacted poorly to the decision to share the inheritance with Susan and her children. Charles, Maria, and Joseph hired a lawyer in an attempt to contest my decision, claiming I was being manipulated by self-interested people. The situation even led to a court hearing, where I had to demonstrate my mental capacity and explain my motivations to a judge. It was a painful but also enlightening experience. Seeing my own children question my sanity simply because I chose to share my assets with people who had shown genuine affection for me confirmed that I had made the right decision. The judge, a wise man of about 60, heard all the testimonies and ruled that I had every right to dispose of my assets as I wished. "Mr. Smith," he said at the end of the hearing, "it is rare to see someone your age with such clear lucidity about what really matters in life. Your decision is upheld." But not all my children reacted the same way. Peter, Anne, and some of the younger ones, after an initial period of hurt, began to reflect on their own attitudes over the years. Gradually, some of them resumed their visits, no longer talking about selling the property or questioning my decisions, but simply to spend time with me and get to know the new family configuration better. Ben officially became my right-hand man in managing the property. At 27, he showed a maturity and wisdom that made me deeply proud. He never questioned my decision to include Susan's family in the inheritance. On the contrary, he was the one who most supported the decision. "Dad," he said in a conversation we had a few months after the revelation, "you did the right thing. Paul, Sandra, and Richard are real siblings to me. And Susan, she brought life back to our home. If that's not worth gold, I don't know what is." The integration of Susan's family only deepened over time. Paul decided to expand his electrician business and opened a small company in town, employing some young people from the area. Whenever possible, he gave priority to the children of small farmers, especially those who had studied with Ben. Sandra was promoted to principal of her school and started a rural education project that benefited children from several properties in the region. Richard modernized his auto repair shop and specialized in agricultural equipment maintenance, becoming a benchmark in the region. But it was with my step-grandchildren that I discovered a joy I thought I had lost forever. The children of Paul, Sandra, and Richard adopted me as their grandfather with impressive naturalness. On weekends, our property transformed into an impromptu amusement park, with children running through the yard, climbing trees, helping to feed the animals, and asking to hear stories from the olden days. It was for these children that I built a tree house in the century-old pine tree, the same tree my father had mentioned in his personal test decades ago. It was a sweet irony. The place that had been associated with greed and disappointment was transformed into a symbol of childhood joy and family unity. In January 2022, I finally fulfilled the promise made to my grandfather and father. I took Ben, Paul, Sandra, and Richard to the waterfall cave to show them the true treasure of the Smith family. It was a 2-hour walk through the woods, following trails I had known since childhood. When we reached the waterfall, after removing the rocks and vegetation that hid the entrance, I lit a lantern and guided them into the cave. What they saw left them speechless. Decades of accumulation had resulted in a true treasure trove. Gold nuggets of various sizes, old coins, some precious stones my grandfather had found over the years, and even some gold bars my father had commissioned when he decided to consolidate part of the wealth. "My God," whispered Sandra, "this is a fortune." "It's our fortune," I corrected. "All of ours." Paul was the first to react practically. "John, we need to think about how to preserve this safely, and also how to use this wealth responsibly." "Exactly," I agreed. "That's why you are here. I want us to decide together how to manage this inheritance." In the weeks that followed, we had several family meetings to discuss the fate of the treasure. The decisions made reflected the values that each had demonstrated over the years. Part of the gold was converted into secure investments that would guarantee a stable income for the entire family. Another part was allocated to the education of the grandchildren, both biological and step-grandchildren. A considerable portion was set aside for community development projects in the rural area where we lived. Sandra proposed using part of the wealth to build a community library and expand the rural school. Paul suggested a rural electrification project that would benefit several small properties in the region. Richard wanted to establish a technical training center for rural youth. Ben proposed an environmental conservation program that would protect the springs and native forests in the area. All the proposals were approved. For the first time in the history of the Smith family, the wealth, accumulated over 3 generations, would be used not just for personal benefit, but for the common good. Susan, my dear wife, was the soul of this entire transformation. At 64, she became the unofficial matriarch of our extended family, coordinating meetings, mediating discussions, and always reminding everyone that the most important thing was not the gold, but the bonds we had built. "John," she said one night as we watched our grandchildren play in the yard, "do you think your grandfather William imagined his test would come this far?" "I think he hoped it would go even further," I replied. "The test was never about the gold itself. It was about teaching that there are things more valuable than material wealth." "And do you think we've learned the lesson?" I looked around. In the yard, children of various ages played together, some blonde like Paul's children, others with brown hair like Sandra's, others red-haired like Richard's, and some with the dark hair. Characteristic of the Smith family, they all treated each other like true cousins, without distinction of origin. On the porch, Ben was talking animatedly with Paul about plans to expand the property's cattle herd. Sandra was helping Richard review the numbers for the technical training center project. Susan coordinated everything with the naturalness of someone born to be the center of a large family. "Yes," I finally replied. "I think we've finally learned." Today, when I receive visits from my biological children who have decided to resume their family relationship, I notice a significant change in their attitudes. They no longer talk about selling the property. They don't question my decisions. They don't show interest in the financial aspect of the inheritance. Instead, they bring their own children to meet their new aunts, uncles, and cousins, participate in the Sunday family lunches, and some have even offered to help with the community projects we are developing. Charles, who was one of the most outraged initially, has become one of the biggest supporters of the community library project. "Dad," he said during a recent visit, I understand now why you did what you did. It took time, but I understood that family is really about love and dedication, not blood or inheritance. Maria still keeps a certain distance, but she brought her grandchildren to see the property and was impressed with the projects we were developing. Joseph, surprisingly, offered to help with the legal side of the investments and donations to the community. But perhaps the most moving moment of these last few years was when I discovered that the tradition of the test was naturally perpetuating itself in the new generation. Last year, Paul told me about a conversation he had with his eldest son, who is 16. "Dad," the boy had said, "is Grandpa John really rich?" "Why do you want to know, son?" "Because some kids at school say that if I'm nice to him, I might inherit something. But I like Grandpa John because he tells cool stories and teaches me things about the farm, not because of money." Paul had felt immense pride in his son's response, and when he told me, I felt that the cycle had been completed. The new generation was naturally learning the lessons that had taken decades for the adults to understand. Last night, Susan asked me a question that made me reflect deeply. "John, if you could go back in time and change anything in this whole story, what would you change?" I thought for a long time before answering. "I would change the way I tested people," I said finally. "I've learned that true love doesn't need tests. The right people show their character naturally through their everyday actions. My grandfather was right about the importance of knowing people's character, but perhaps there were less painful ways to find out. And do you regret anything?" "I regret wasting so many years doubting people, taking so long to trust the love that was right in front of me. You, Ben, your children. You taught me that family is a choice we make every day, not just an accident of birth. Today, as I write these last lines under the oak tree that has become a symbol of our story, I realize that I have finally understood the true lesson of my grandfather William. The gold was always just a means, never an end. A means to test character, to teach values, to discover who truly loves us for who we are, not for what we have. The real wealth was always in the people, who chose to stay by our side, not out of interest, but out of genuine love. I look around and see my true inheritance: Ben, who grew up to be an upright and wise man; Susan, who brought light back into my life when I thought it had been extinguished forever; Paul, Sandra, and Richard, who welcome me as a true father; and a whole new generation of children who will grow up knowing that a person's worth is not measured by the gold they possess, but by the love they are capable of giving and receiving. The oak tree continues to bear fruit every year, its roots deep and firm, supporting branches that extend in all directions. It is a perfect metaphor for our family, rooted in solid values, but always growing, always welcoming new members, always offering its fruits to those who know how to value them. If my grandfather William could see where the test he created almost a century ago has led, I think he would be proud. Not only because we found people worthy of trust, but because we learned that true wealth lies in the ability to love and be loved. The gold from the waterfall cave is still there, but now it has a greater purpose. Not just to enrich a family, but to enrich an entire community. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that wealth only has value when it is shared with love. And you? Have you discovered what your true treasure is? Have you realized that sometimes the most important people in our lives are not those we were born with, but those who chose to stay with us? Leave a comment from which city you are reading this story and tell us about someone who became family to you not by blood, but by choice and dedication. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe that true love is worth more than all the gold in the world, don't forget to like and share, because stories like this need to be told, need to be remembered, need to inspire other people to value what truly matters in life. And remember, the greatest treasure we can leave for future generations is not material possessions, but solid values, genuine love, and the wisdom to distinguish between what glitters and what truly has value. Because in the end, when our story comes to a close, We will be remembered not for the gold we accumulated, but for the love we planted and the hearts we touched. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. May it inspire you to treasure the right people and to be a person who deserves to be treasured by others, because that is the true wealth of life.